Welcome everyone to the Zoom room. We're just taking a moment to let folks all into the space. Wonderful. As we're getting settled into this Zoom meeting, I remind you to keep yourselves on mute during the presentation and to announce that this meeting is being recorded. So we're so glad that you are all here. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's forum discussion entitled Net Zero is Fake Zero: Why We Need Real Emissions Reductions, Not Gimmicks and False Promises. My name is Susanna Tuttle, and I am the director of the Eco-Justice Connection program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. Many of you know the energy and democracy and justice work of our North Carolina Interfaith Power and Light campaign as members of the U.S. Climate Action Network. And we are eternally grateful to the many, many hours so many of you across the country have contributed as faithful volunteers. Briefly, I want to share that the Council's Eco-Justice Connection is actively working to become an anti-racist program of the North Carolina Council of Churches. We believe that relationships must be centered in justice and equity within the human family, as well as with all of the natural world. We strive together toward this sacred goal. It's a joy to welcome you today. We are so grateful that you are here to bear witness to this vital work. We're also incredibly grateful for our speakers that are here with us to share their experience and expertise. Sriram and Basav are colleagues and also friends. They will be introducing themselves to you shortly. Before we begin with the presentation, we want to open our time together with a land acknowledgement and an acknowledgement of Indigenous communities. Here, where I am in North Carolina, as in every other part of this country, we are on Indigenous land, and acknowledging that the land we reside within and depend upon is one way we seek to orient ourselves in the work and do the work of justice in our lives. I will uplift that the land I call home in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, is the land of the Occaneechi Band of the Saponi Nation. I invite all of you to place your names, organizations, the name of the people whose land you rely upon now in the chat. If you do not know, this is also an invitation to learn. This work requires continuous learning and humility, and it is work that we can do together. Again, we are so grateful that you have joined us in community today for this critically important discussion. I will now pass it over first to Sriram, and then he'll pass it to Basav to make their introductions.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you today. And Susanna, thank you so much for that grounding and for the creation of this space. My name is Sriram Madhusudanan. I'm the U.S. Climate Campaign Director with Corporate Accountability. I use he, him pronouns. And in terms of just a brief introduction of corporate accountability and our work, we are a member-powered organization, and we have for decades worked to challenge the deadly abuses of transnational corporations and hold them more accountable to people and democratically controlled institutions. And on our climate campaign, we work with our members and partners here in the US and globally to lead a campaign demanding that we kick big polluters out of climate policy at every level, that we make them pay for decades of climate deception and advance real climate solutions. And I'll pass it to Basav.
Hi, yes. My name is Basav Sen, and I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Climate Policy Director at the Institute for Policy Studies, and I am on Piscataway Nation's land outside Washington, D.C. And for those of you who don't know, Institute for Policy Studies is a very multi-issue progressive think tank. We work on economic justice and racial justice and a demilitarized peaceful foreign policy and climate justice, among several other issues. And with that, I'm going to jump into the presentation. Um, the title is Net Zero is Fake Zero, and why we need real emissions reductions and not gimmicks and false promises. Okay, so I'll start with looking at where did the term net zero come from? I would argue that it's from a misrepresentation and a misunderstanding of what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, um, presented, for example, in their special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. So yes, it is true that the IPCC did find that in all of the scenarios they modeled, emissions did not go down quickly enough to keep global surface temperature increase to an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And it required some amount of what is called drawdown or removal of excess greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. However, they themselves presented many different scenarios, and I have a few of them up there, and each one of them is different in terms of how much emissions actually could be removed and how much needed to be drawn down. And if you say net zero without specifying how much emissions you're drawing down and how close to actual zero you're getting, what you're saying means pretty much nothing. And let me explain with what's called the absurdity limit argument, which is a simple math concept of uh, just taking things to their limit to find out what they could or couldn't mean. For instance, if you were to keep global emissions at exactly the level they are today, and somehow find a way to draw all of that down, you would still be net zero. In other words, you would be net zero with no emissions reductions whatsoever. And obviously, another way of getting to net zero is to get to zero, eliminate all your emissions, right? And if you just say your target is net zero, you're not specifying where on that target you fall. And mathematically, what you're saying is fairly meaningless. Also, note one other thing about the scenarios I've presented in here. One of them, the one on the far left called P1, does not rely on this method called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, to get to their net zero. And this is actually significant. All it is relying on is agriculture, namely restoring healthy soils and restoring forests to draw down any excess emissions, and otherwise just rely on cutting emissions as close to zero as you can get. And here's a illustration of what I was saying. Suppose you have 100 tons of emissions and you remove 100 tons. That's net zero. If you've cut all your emissions, you're emitting 0 tons of CO2, that's also net zero. And obviously, these two scenarios are very different in terms of their ecological and social justice um, impact. Because think about it. Um, when you have 0 tons of CO2, it means you've substantially eliminated fossil fuels. So you've substantially eliminated your particulate matter emissions, your nitrogen oxide emissions, your water contamination from um, fracking and drilling, etc. And when you have the full 100 ton CO2, you haven't done that. So the impacts ecologically and in terms of social justice are vastly different. And here are some quotes from the IPCC report, which make the point that really we cannot afford not to set a goal of the maximum possible emissions reductions, not net zero, but emissions reductions as quickly as possible. Significant near-term emissions reductions and measures to lower, let me see the full, energy and land demand can limit carbon dioxide removal deployment to a few hundred gigatons without reliance on uh, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS. So the translation from these three quotes that I have on here is that we need to front load emissions cuts right now. And the more we do that, the less we need to uh, to rely on uh, these carbon dioxide removal technologies. And with that, I will pass on to Sriram.
Hi, everyone. One sec as I just get my presentation up here. Okay, are folks seeing my slides? Great. Okay, it's always a little strange to do this in the context of Zoom, but here we are more than a year into a pandemic. Okay, thank you so much, Basa, for that really helpful introduction and grounding when we were just overall looking at net zero, what it is perceived to mean and what it really is at the end of the day. So in terms of what I hope to do with a little bit of the time here, before I hand it back to Basa, is to speak to some of the ways in which from our perspective as corporate accountability, and honestly in a very problematic and unhelpful way, we're really starting to see net zero emerge as a new vehicle for corporate greenwashing. And then I'll transition into some of the key issues with the false solutions. Really, to call them solutions is even in some ways giving them too much credit because they're really industry-driven schemes at the end of the day. But the false solutions that are often folded under the banner of net zero, chief among them carbon markets and offsets, and then I'll pass the mic back to Basov to round us out with some of the other ones that we often see under this umbrella, namely bioenergy and direct air capture. But as you see from my first slide here, right, we have seen in the past year just a dizzying number of net zero pledges at such a pace that honestly it's difficult to keep track of even the details of some of these. Some of them keep being updated every few months or so. But we've seen everyone from the big banks, the airlines, agribusiness, not to mention the oil majors, coming out with some version of a net zero pledge, often net zero by 2050. Now, this sounds nice, right? Wow, look, all these corporations, many of whom have been fueling the crisis, are coming out and they're declaring their intent to be climate leaders. But let's just step back for a second and ask the question, can we trust these folks? Really, can we trust these corporations, right? Because corporations aren't people. But let's consider the history of how we got here. We know that where we are today in 2021 is no accident. We are here because of the intentional actions of a handful of corporations and CEOs who've known for decades the reality of burning fossil fuels and who have used their considerable political and economic power to put us on a path towards runaway emissions and catastrophic climate change. Big oil corporations like Exxon and Shell knew the climate damaging impacts of burning fossil fuels decades ago. And they're facing a growing wave of litigation today to hold them accountable for that. And yet, at the same time, even since the Paris Agreement was signed, these corporations, if we even just look at the top 5 of these corporations, have spent over $1 billion on misleading climate-related branding and lobbying. That number is probably even larger. This is from a couple years ago. And don't just take my word for it. If you look at an analysis from, this is from Oil Change International, October of last year, of the industry's own pledges, on almost every measure, net zero pledges are not providing a pathway to keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees. They're not ending oil exploration. There's no often long-term production phase-out plans. And overwhelmingly, they're relying on carbon offsets and sequestration, which we'll come back to some of the issues with that. So bottom line, net zero, as it currently exists, does not equal 1.5. And that's before we even get to the feasibility of some of these plans, let alone all of these plans taken together. So this is an analysis from Grain, which came out, I think, about a month ago or so. But if you look at the plans of just 3 corporations, Nestle, Eni, and Shell alone, they are depending for their sequestration needs on 20 million hectares per year for their collective offsets needs. Now that is an area of land that's roughly the size of all of the forested lands in Malaysia every single year. So we're talking about massive, massive areas of land, often predominantly in the global south, that would be needed to meet some of these plans to offset significant portions of emissions while not actually cutting emissions at the source. That's really important to hold on to, because I think that is the core of our critique with net zero, is that we need to be focusing on real solutions like ending our dependence on fossil fuels and providing for a just transition for workers and impacted communities today, not 10 years into the future, but today. And so what the facts show is that there is a massive gap between production or really emissions, production, fossil fuel production, that's implied either in climate pledges or what currently is happening and current future trends, and those that would be needed to be consistent with 1.5. And even just taking a step back from this, from our perspective, net zero is not surprising. It's in fact a symptom of a deeper dysfunction that we see all the time in our political systems, where we're talking about in the US or whether we're talking about globally, right? We look at this august body in the form of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UN Climate Treaty. It's been in existence for a quarter century. That's like 75% of the time that I've been alive. And in that period, it has failed to deliver on meaningful climate solutions. In fact, the Paris Agreement itself doesn't even mention the words fossil fuels. And why? It's not rocket science. Big polluters, the corporations that have been fueling this crisis for decades, are in the room, either themselves through representatives or through their trade associations. And these are many of the corporations who are responsible for over 70% of global emissions. And we have to ask our question, can we trust, given the history that we went through in the earlier slide, can we trust these corporations to manage their own decline? Can we trust these corporations to justly transition and take care not of their CEOs first, but of their workers and impacted communities, many of whom have been demanding justice for decades? So I think that is one of the core questions I would like to leave us with. And I'm going to transition briefly just to get a layer deeper into some of the false solutions that are either implied or often a part of net zero plans. 5 minutes or an hour total for this is really not enough to get into the weeds enough or meaningfully. And so Basav and I will definitely be leaving you all with some further resources and reading, but let's just touch briefly on carbon markets and offsets. So first of all, what are carbon markets? They can be very complicated, but let's just simplify the core of it. Carbon markets work off of the assumption that we put a price on carbon emissions, And that means that polluters, meaning countries or mega corporations, can continue to emit greenhouse gases for a price. Now, this could work through cap and trade, where you establish a national, state, regional, sectoral limit on emissions. Everyone gets a quota, and those with a surplus, because they pollute less, get to trade with those who pollute more. This is how the EU emissions trading system, for example, works. Or you can have offsets, right? So this is, let's say Chevron has a refinery in Richmond, California, real world example. They can say that, oh, well, we're protecting this patch of forest in the Brazilian Amazon, so whatever we're burning here at this refinery in Richmond, let alone the impacts of the refinery operations on the community on the ground, like, okay, that's right, that's meaningful, that's still happening. But we're paying someone halfway around the world to suck this carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Another example of this is well, we all probably haven't flown in a while, but if you were on a British Airways or another global airline carrier, you probably get those little things in the seat pockets, which say, oh, well, donate this much and you can offset the emissions from your flight. Doesn't mean that fossil fuel wasn't burned, that jet fuel didn't go up into the atmosphere, but you're theoretically paying for that to be sucked out by preserving forests somewhere else. But much more we can talk about that, but what are the problems with markets and offsets? Well, first and foremost, and I think most importantly, we are not keeping fossil fuels in the ground, right? That jet fuel is being burned, it is out into the atmosphere. It is really theoretical that it's going to be sucked back out into trees and into forests that are protected. Secondly, dodgy math, right? We're talking about carbon that has been stored underground on geological timescales, and we are rapidly burning it and putting it up into the atmosphere. And that's going to be temporarily sucked out into trees for a finite period of time while those trees are alive. They'll decompose, they'll go back to the atmosphere. It's not addressing the deep and long, really powerful ways in which the carbon cycle is being disrupted simply by putting a price on carbon or putting in offsets. And are these trees protected in actuality or just on paper, right? We've seen massive, not only growth in deforestation that is driven by cattle ranching, the timber industry. This is continuing to happen. How are we actually meaningfully and in reality protecting these forests? The thing is, in reality too, carbon markets are not a new solution. In one form or another, whether you look at the Kyoto Protocol, the Clean Development Mechanism there, RED Plus, these have been around for decades, and they frankly have a spotty track record in actually reducing emissions, not only at the source, but over the long run. We're looking at global colonialism basically being perpetuated here, right? When we create a system that depends on people paying to access it, who has more resources to access it, right? We're talking effectively, especially in the UN context, of global north countries like the US and the EU that are historically responsible for the vast majority of carbon dioxide pollution, paying countries in the global south to protect forests while not actually reducing their own emissions, which would be in line with their own fair share of reducing carbon dioxide emissions and supporting countries around the world in doing so. So really it's a very unjust and colonial way to approach the issue of the climate crisis. And last but certainly not least, when we look at this, I mean, frankly, when we look at putting a price on anything, but certainly in this case with atmospheric carbon, we're talking, and forests, we are talking about a form of privatization, of commodification. And we've seen time and time again, right, that this continues to fuel land grabs in the global south, that it harms indigenous communities, often leading to instances where they're being displaced from the land. And it is a really harmful perpetuation of centuries of genocide against indigenous communities. So we really do need to take that seriously when we see and we hear the critiques from really frontline and indigenous communities about why we need to move, not really prioritize carbon markets and instead focus on keeping fossil fuels in the ground. And now the last thing I'll just mention here, and is always the approach that we take at corporate accountability when we're looking at a so-called solution that's out there and assessing it with a critical eye, is let's follow the money. Who is pushing carbon markets? Who stands to benefit the most from a global carbon market or carbon trading regime? Right? And just one example of this that I'll point out is that one of the organizations, trade associations, that is most vociferously pushing carbon markets at the national and international levels is the International Emissions Trading Association. This is an organization that was formed in the late 90s and counts among its founders BP and Rio Tinto. It has some of these corporations, including Chevron and Shell, on its board. And the story from The Intercept is from 2018, when one of these executives whose access to the talks was really through the International Emissions Trading Association, or IETA, was bragging and boasting about the extent of their power and influence in shaping the implementation of the Paris Agreement. In fact, at COP25 in 2019, there were more representatives of IETA at the talks than the entire delegation of the European Union. And so this really does raise significant questions of who's in the room, who's advancing an agenda for whom, and who stands to benefit at the end of the day. And certainly from our perspective, carbon markets are deeply problematic because they continue to engender dependence on a fossil fuel economy and don't move us to the real solutions, which are cutting fossil fuel emissions at source. And so with that, I'm going to pass it to Basav and stop sharing my screen.
Hi, thanks, Sriram. And I'm going to dive into the weeds on two specific so-called negative emission solutions, which supposedly draw down excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And the first one, the acronym is BECCS. It's called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. Essentially, what it is it's burning biomass such as wood for energy, and then capturing the CO2 emitted and storing it underground. So the CO2 is not exiting the smokestack. Now, there are two unfounded assumptions in this entire conception of BECCS as a negative emissions technology. To begin with, you need to assume that burning biomass is carbon neutral because trees grow. So you cut down a tree and burn it, another tree grows in its place that also sequesters carbon, and therefore burning biomass is carbon neutral. The problem is you can't just wave your hand and assume that. There are complications around the plant growth cycle and replacement rate. If you're cutting down trees faster than they are growing to regenerate, obviously your assumption breaks down. And also you need to take into account how many more years the tree that you cut down could have kept growing and could have sequestered CO2. And what's more, you need to take into account the rate at which the trees that you're cutting down are getting replaced. So if it takes years for there to be enough tree growth to replace this forest you've cut down, well, that's years we don't have if we need to get our emissions down quickly. And the second questionable assumption is that the carbon emitted at the point of combustion can be effectively captured and stored. And what if it can't? And this is not just a hypothetical question. It is a fact that capturing carbon from smokestacks is a very questionable technology and very expensive too. So there are actual examples of attempting to capture carbon from smokestacks, typically with fossil fuel burning, not that many with biomass. But it is inordinately expensive, and the Global Carbon Capture and Storage Institute, which it's important to flag, is an organization that supports CCS. Even they estimate that initial CCS would increase the cost of electricity generation some 45 to 70%. And these costs are estimated to fall only by 20 to 30% with more widespread implementation. So removing carbon from a smokestack is very expensive. And the main way that CCS can offset its costs is by selling the captured CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, which is that you take the CO2, you pump it into an oil well that's depleted to produce still more oil from it. So there goes your so-called climate benefit from capturing the carbon. And there is also an opportunity cost issue here, which is that there are much better things to invest in to address the climate crisis than to invest in CCS. And these are just examples of estimates out there for how much investment is needed in the United States alone and for the electricity sector alone, not counting transportation, buildings, agriculture, and all the other sectors where we need to address our emissions. And so chasing this unicorn technology of carbon capture without even any solid evidence that it'll work would be squandering our resources. And then growing trees, growing bioenergy to act as feedstocks for this bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, has profound justice impacts, especially on farming communities and indigenous communities, especially in the global south. And remember, these are communities who are already impoverished. They're already facing deep economic uncertainty. And here you're asking people who contributed very little to cause climate change in the first place to again make sacrifices by giving up their land, by um, facing economic uncertainty and loss of food security to address problems created by other people, specifically wealthy people in the global north.
Asav, I just want to let you know that we're not seeing your slides. So if you want to try and share your screen one more time, you can go ahead and do that.
Okay.
And thanks everyone for these really fantastic questions. I am dropping them into a document so that we can get to all of them at the end of the presentation. Really appreciate it. Keep them coming.
So
Yep.
sorry about that. I thought I had shared my screen. Evidently I hadn't.
Well, you can flip through them now and just reference them and get to where you were.
Okay, I've moved on to where I am now, and so now I'll talk about direct air capture, which I call finding needles in haystacks at scale. So what direct air capture is, it's a technology to pull carbon dioxide out of ambient air, out of regular air. And remember that the CO2 concentration in ambient air today is about 420 parts per million, which is way bigger than it should be. But regardless, it's still chemically a trace gas that you're trying to pull out of the atmosphere. And just basic science tells you that that's extremely hard to do and would take an inordinate amount of energy, which is in fact correct. So if we were to rely on direct air capture, these uh, direct air capture machines could be using as much as a quarter of global energy by the year 2100. Um, Again, think about uh, the cost of that. Think about the justice implications of that in a world in which many people, especially in the global south, but you'd be surprised to know even in a wealthy country like the United States, face energy poverty. uh, there's large swaths of the global south where people do not have access to electricity, and even here in the United States, as much as 1/3 of the population faces what's called energy insecurity, meaning they um, either frequently get disconnected from their utilities, or they have to keep their thermostat at an unsafe temperature to be able to afford to pay the bills. And by the way, that percentage rises to more than 50% in indigenous communities and Black communities and low income communities. So there is a very important intersection of energy poverty with race and class, unsurprisingly. And this is what I call an energy opportunity cost issue. As we address fossil fuel use across our economy, we have to electrify building heating, converting from natural gas. We have to convert our transportation system to um, electricity from gas burning internal combustion engines. And so electricity demand will inevitably rise. And these are scenarios for how much demand growth we are going to see. And even with aggressive energy efficiency measures across the economy, we are going to see rise in energy demand. These scenarios here show 80% increase in electricity demand by 2050 with the kind of electrification we are looking at. And the last thing we can afford is to use a lot of electricity for direct air capture. And again, there is a question about what could happen to this captured CO2. It could, as I pointed out, be used for enhanced oil recovery, which means there goes your claim of negative emissions. You're getting actually more emissions. Or you're converting the captured CO2 to synthetic carbon-based fuels, and again, thereby generating more emissions. So if you do either of those things, you cannot claim that direct air capture is a negative emissions technology. That's just greenwashing. And see, there is an underlying problem, and Sriram also addressed this in his section. Why, uh, you know, pushing solutions like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage or direct air capture not only don't address the problem, they create a dangerous distraction. And as Sriram pointed out, fossil fuel and utility and other polluting industries love negative emissions. And why is that? It's because successful implementation of these technologies, and that's extremely unlikely to happen, but if it were to happen, it would prevent the assets which they've invested so much capital in from becoming stranded and becoming useless. And they could, recover more economic value out of them. Even more importantly, I would argue that even if these so-called negative emissions technologies never materialize, the promise of their implementation, however unlikely, can be a cover for polluters to keep polluting, saying, oh yeah, we will sequester all of this carbon we are emitting today by the time we get to 2050. Don't worry about it. We can just pursue business as usual for now. And the longer we persist in following these dangerous and costly distractions, the longer we delay solving the problem. And we absolutely cannot afford this delay. We need to start keeping fossil fuels in the ground and pursuing a just transition away from extractivism today. And I think that brings me to the end of my section and on to Sriram.
Hi. Yes, and I think I know we're a little over time here, so I'll actually just keep this short. First, as I mentioned earlier, there's many more resources if you're looking to understand more, some of which Basav and I mentioned, but really insightful analysis, particularly from a number of them from frontline communities that have been fighting these false solutions, industry-driven schemes for decades. And I think before we transition into the Q&A portion, and thanks for folks who've been jumping in already in the chat. But I think I just want to leave folks with three things. One, as we might see this week leading into the Earth Day Summit, if the yardstick against which we are measuring so-called climate leadership is net zero, that's really problematic for all the reasons Basav and I just walked through. Number two, net zero is a dangerous distraction. It's really displacing the real solutions and the real conversation we need to be having about how we're going to have a just transition off of fossil fuels for workers and impacted communities and a managed decline of fossil fuel production. And finally, the phenomenon of net zero isn't new. It's merely the latest chapter in a long history of corporate climate denial and greenwashing that has one underlying purpose, which is to protect a business model that's dependent on continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it to Susanna to facilitate us through the Q&A.
Great, thank you so much. Really pretty amazing how much you were able to get through in such a short amount of time. So we appreciate both you so much. As I mentioned in the chat, the PDF of the slides will be shared along with this great list of resources that Sriram just dropped into the chat, and we'll go straight into questions for the last couple of minutes we have together. So I'm going to go with what we had in the chat. Carmen says, super curious, are there any examples of companies, large multinationals doing this right? Great question.
I'm happy to jump in there. And I think there's two pieces to that, right? I mean, if we look at the history over the last few decades, no, quite frankly, time and time again, we see corporations like Shell, Exxon, Chevron, put out far into the future commitments, or honestly pledges, taking credit for that in the news cycle today, while there really being very little for them to show. And let's not forget, I think they're really coming out with these kinds of pledges and commitments now because the climate denial game is up. They just can't continue to lie about the impacts of climate change or to continue a denial scenario. And so net zero happens to be very convenient in presenting themselves as being climate leaders, while actually being quite squishy on the details of what they're committing themselves to do, as we saw in the OCI analysis. I think the second thing is more of a political approach, which is, what do we trust? Do we take their word for it right now? Our analysis as corporate accountability is like, that's not really something we have the time to mess around with. We know the IPCC says that we must reduce emissions by the end of the decade. We're going to have to take meaningful action in the next few years to ensure that that's reflected in policy. And if we waste that time on false solutions like carbon markets or BECCS, direct air capture, we will be seeing a much graver scenario that we'll be facing by the end of the decade. Basav, I don't know if there's anything that you'd add to that, but that's what I'd say there.
No, that's good. Great.
Awesome. And Alexandra had a similar question to the questions that I've asked both of you as to how I got interested in this net zero is fake zero, because I was hoodwinked for a while there and I no longer want to be. Alexandra asks, I actually thought that carbon markets were the solution in developing countries, as so much still relies on fossil fuel production. If this is not the solution, I mean, carbon pricing schemes, then what could be in developing countries?
I can take a quick stab at that. So the answer ultimately always comes back to a just transition. What we need is not carbon markets, but a just transition. And for countries in the global south who are dependent on fossil fuel extraction as a source of employment, as a source of foreign exchange, etc., it is incumbent upon wealthy countries who, number one, have been um, historic beneficiaries of the Industrial Revolution and have contributed disproportionately to cumulative global greenhouse gas emissions. It is incumbent upon those countries to provide just transition assistance to countries in the global south who are dependent on fossil fuel extraction. And what's more, I would point out that this is not charity, this is responsibility. There is a responsibility of wealthy countries to provide uh, funding to extraction dependent countries in the global south to diversify their economy away from fossil fuel extraction so that they don't have to rely on that as a source of employment and foreign exchange anymore.
Thank you for that. The U.S. Fair Share, I'm going to drop the website into the chat as well. That's a foundational set of principles that go into the U.S. Fair Share NDC, speaks just to exactly what you shared, Basav. So thank you for that. Our next question comes from Kate. I'm a financial advisor working with more progressive folks around their investments. I've seen an uptick in people asking me how we can support net zero plus investments, and I'm grateful to learn from all of you today, as am I. So she can share what she's learning with these clients. Would love to hear if you both think any of these frameworks for investors go beyond platitudes and distraction.
I can't speak to the frameworks, but what I think the question I would be asking is, when we're talking about net zero frameworks or encouraging net zero investments, is that linked up, or is that part and parcel of a divestment strategy? Like, are we talking about banks that are ending their financing of fossil fuels and fossil fuel infrastructure today, or are we talking about paying banks that are taking credit for supporting a net zero agenda while drawing attention away from the manifold ways in which their investments are still tied up with fossil fuels? So that's one of the questions that I would be asking there, and I think it's an important one in terms of how can the financial industry be held accountable for its role in fueling climate chaos. And it's a very important one because they do have a huge role to play. And many frontline communities have been calling for an ending of that financing, in particular from big banks, insurance companies, and the like.
Thanks for that. And thank you, Carmen, for putting some additional information, including a link from Walmart into the chat. And we are really looking forward to continuing this conversation beyond the hour that we have today. So let's be sure, we're going to send out the information and with our contact information also, so that we can be in touch beyond this hour. But I am going to jump over to to Chloe's question about hydrogen. Hydrogen seems to be one of the buzzword-esque solutions touted by major oil and gas polluters, and one that they can continue to capitalize on. From your work, have you found that to be the case? And as above, how can we ensure we don't abandon potential solutions just because the bad guys have jumped on the bandwagon? And I'll give each of you sort of your closing remarks in this as well. So Basav, let's hear from you on that important conversation, because I do believe that nuclear was the elephant in the room at the Paris, at all the COPs, right?
So first, the particular question about hydrogen. So the question is, where does the hydrogen come from? Not all hydrogen is made equal. Most hydrogen is industrially produced by a process called steam reformation of methane. Where does the methane come from? From fracking. So really the source is fossil fuels. So it's a way to continue fossil fuel production. It's almost like money laundering. It's energy laundering. You take dirty energy and hey, here's this magical process. I've turned it into something clean like hydrogen, which we are oxidizing in a fuel cell and just getting water out the other end. Don't look over there where the fracking's happening. That's what's happening in this case. The only way you can produce hydrogen without relying on fracking is to electrolyze water. Is to take water, split it using electricity into hydrogen and oxygen. And if you do that, that's not an energy source. You're taking electricity you've generated some other way to produce hydrogen. Now, you can have a debate on whether that is or isn't more effective than a battery as a form of energy storage in some context. But let's not kid ourselves that hydrogen is an energy source that's clean, because it isn't. And your more general question is an interesting one. I'd say the guiding principle is look at a solution. Is it harming frontline communities? Is it harming workers? Is it harming people who did not create the climate crisis? Is it asking them to sacrifice in the interests of allowing big business to continue business as usual? In that case, it's a false solution. So, yeah, on to you, Sriram.
I think, Basav, you kind of pretty eloquently captured it there. One, sorry, I muted myself. One resource just to build on that question of real solutions versus false solutions, and really moving beyond this, this debate that we're in right now that is really framed by market-based approaches to the climate crisis, is really looking at how do we step beyond that. So this is a briefing that was created that really highlights some of the real solutions in multiple sectors ahead of COP25. But I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that, as Basav said, it's not only a matter of who's most impacted, but really where the solutions have been coming from. I think that when we see these false solutions, as we mentioned, carbon markets is another one that have really come from the industry, that have been seeded by the industry, we've got to bear in mind that that is for a particular set of reasons, and also looking at where the real solutions are coming from, because communities already around the world are leading the way in real solutions to the climate crisis, community-controlled solutions. They're focused on agroecology, on energy efficiency, on moving beyond fossil fuels. And we really need to ensure that we're creating the framework and the container for those to take root, to succeed, and to achieve the kind of scale that they need to, not continuing to perpetuate a fossil fuel economy that, as we all know now, is not only fueling climate chaos, but has manifold human rights, social justice impacts right now. And so we just simply can't continue to accept sacrifice zones so a handful of corporations can get filthy rich while the rest of the planet is burning.
Preach. My brothers, this is incredible. Well, thanks to all of you. I am dropping into the chat right now each of our 3 organizations' Twitter handles. If you can help amplify this message, we're using the hashtag #ClimateFairShare. So you can follow that Twitter feed as well. I will work today to get this recording up onto YouTube so that I can send it out to all of you with all of the fabulous resources in the chat that were listed. This is a very important week with Biden Summit on April 22nd and the 23rd, the US NDCs being released, and the more that we can amplify and educate, inspire, and mobilize people to address the climate emergency with real solutions. We have them, we can do it. Together, we believe we will win. So thank you again for your time, your energy, your commitment, for all that you do, and we look forward to staying in touch. Thank you so much. Be well.